So welcome everyone. My name is Amber Reed. I'm the president of AAPI New Jersey, she, her pronouns. So happy that you could join us today for our first lunch and learn about data disaggregation and language access and what you can do to support these priorities. We are really thrilled to be joined not only by members of our own advocacy team, but by special guest Anjali Mehrotra, member of New Jersey's AAPI Commission and women's rights leader and advocate. And later in the call, we'll be joined by Assemblywoman Ellen Park as well, who's been a key legislative champion for these priorities. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Jeff Chang, our advocacy chair, to start the first part of our program, which will be about language access.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Jeff. I'm the chair of our advocacy committee here at AAPI New Jersey, formerly AAPI Montclair. And I'm happy to be joined by other members of our advocacy committee, Susan and Danielle, who are here as well. I'm going to cover a little bit about language access. We're really happy that everyone's joining us for our first Lunch and Learn. We hope to schedule lunch and learns about every month on a key issue that we're working on. Next month, we're hoping that it's going to be about abolish the line. So everyone hopefully can stay tuned for when we finalize that date. But today we're going to focus on language access, the language access bill, and also the data disaggregation bill. Both of these bills are our top priorities here at AAPI New Jersey. And we really want to thank everyone for taking action. And we'll also have more information in our presentation about how you can spread the word, what we really need to get done to get these bills passed right now. We are in a very interesting phase right now in New Jersey legislature, the lame duck period. It's basically when a year's worth of legislation tries to get pushed through the legislature in about 1 month. That lame duck session ends on, I believe, January 9th. So we really have a very small window. That being said, we've identified both these issues as priorities for both 2023 and 2024. So Amber, do you mind if you could share the deck? So Language Access Bill A3837 is really, from the very beginning, it's been the core of our advocacy agenda. AAPIs are the most linguistically diverse community. Anjali will go into more about sort of how we're counted as a community, but there are, we want to go to the next slide. There's over 2.6 million people in New Jersey who speak a language other than English. It's one of the highest percentage of anywhere in the country. And 42.5% of our immigrant communities are limited English proficient, which means that oftentimes they will want and need materials in the language that they communicate in. And when we think about being heard and being able to be heard and to be understood, I mean, that's really such a fundamental part in how we interact, right, in our schools, in our workplaces, when we try to get information about how to take care of ourselves or families, how we access benefits, tax relief programs, low-income community members who need access to, public benefits, everything from, how we interact with law enforcement. We can go on and on and on about why language access is so important. But we know that when we can't have these programs, the information about it, if we can't be able to understand them in the language that we communicate in, it's essentially denying us access to those really important services. We just came out of a really awful public health crisis during the pandemic. Imagine having to go through something like that again, and our community members not having access to that critical public health information. How to get basic health care for themselves and their families. This is a major priority of ours. And if we go to the next slide, going a little bit more about, why this is so important. Everything from going to the motor vehicles department and getting something, renewed, to, trying to get, to seek your employment rights. Last week, I met with one of our members who said that her parents, one of her, her father in Long Island had to get, heart surgery. And in New York, they've had a language access, law in place for several years now. And she was so grateful that the hospital proactively offered, translation services. So, she didn't have to translate for her father. They had someone that was familiar that could, talk about medical terms, medical issues, explain it to her father, and help her father make the decision for himself as to what kind of procedure he wanted. And she asked, is this available in New Jersey? And she was scared that if she had to go through this in New Jersey, what that would mean for her family. So again, when we talk about language access, some of these issues are life and death. I mean, the most critical times when we need to be heard and understood, at the hospital, really highlights why language access is so important. Go to the next slide. Another example, applying for, property tax relief or rental relief. Right now, the state has a really great program called Anchor. Anchor is a wonderful program. I highly recommend everyone to Google Anchor New Jersey for more information about how to apply. Many homeowners or renters are eligible for, $750 to, I believe, about $2,000 or more, a check sent to you. Anchor right now, this program, they only offer applications in English and Spanish. So again, a huge part of our community is, can't access this critical relief that they're entitled to. The next slide. Reporting a bias incident. Again, our community continues to be hit hard by bias incidents. Currently, there isn't adequate, translation services for the Asian American community. You can see that the service, NJ Bias, which is a reporting system, is only available in English and Spanish. If you speak Hindi or Chinese or Korean, you would not be able to access this critical reporting portal. Next slide. So what would this bill do? The bill will require translation of written materials, of vital government documents, and also interpretation in 15 languages. These 15 languages, these are some examples. They would be tied to census data. And also each government agency in New Jersey would be required to create a report that would include data as to, the most common community members, populations that one agency, for example, might have a need for Bengali translations. Another agency may not have so many Bengali community members. They might need another language. So this law would provide some flexibility in trying to deliver the most inclusive set of languages based on what the community needs. And there is a component of collecting that data and making sure that there's continuous improvement. And it also would require every single state agency to create a card, a uniform card that says "I speak" with a list of all of the languages. And so when folks go to, say, the DMV, they will see this and they can point to the language that they want to communicate in. And then written translation and oral interpretation services would be offered. The next slide. The current status of the bill, the Senate has already passed it, so we really need to get this out of the Assembly and posted, for a vote. Currently, we really needed to get out of this committee called the State and Local Government Committee that is chaired by Assemblyman Borelli. And we also need the Assembly Speaker, Speaker Coughlin, Craig Coughlin, to make it a priority and post it. Amber and one of our members, Meredith, was in Trenton yesterday and had a really frustrating experience. Amber, I don't know if you want to share a little bit about what you saw on the ground yesterday in Trenton.
Sure. Yesterday was kind of an amazing day of energy in Trenton because people were also there for same-day voter registration and domestic workers' bill of rights. So you had all of these like beautiful, diverse people who showed up and came together in the morning to deliver a letter about language access bill, the language access bill, and how important it is for our communities with, I think, over 120 organizational signatures written by the Alliance for Immigrant Justice on what was literally like a 50-foot scroll. So like our beautiful, our beautiful sort of like power to the people procession took this scroll, which was, miraculously did not rip at any point, even though we were sort of like making turns and going up and down stairs. We took this scroll to the Assembly Majority Office and we saw this sort of, I don't know, it was really startling to me to see these staffers look at us and instead of sort of wanting to hear us and wanting us to come in, there's kind of like a stony look that came over their faces. And they had a word with a state police officer, and he literally closed this heavy metal door to the Assembly Majority Office in our faces. And then he stood in front. It was like a scene from like Lord of the Rings or something when Aragorn like shuts the door to the dwarf mines. And then this trooper was just standing there looking at us. And so we chanted and we said our piece and they made us take it to like the clerk's office or something to drop it off. But it was just like thank you for providing us with this physical metaphor for what we feel is happening when we try to make our voices heard. It doesn't, I don't really know why this bill wouldn't be something that people want to do because it helps to advance their own priorities and sort of like make more people able to access some of their signature initiatives and, really hard work they've put into making this state a fair and welcoming place for all. So it was a little bit of a frustrating day. It was an interesting day, and I think we have to keep showing up and showing how much this matters to our communities until we get through to them.
Thanks for sharing. Before we talk about kind of action steps, does anyone have any questions about this bill? It is pretty extensive, but we just wanted to give everyone like a quick overview. But does anyone have any immediate questions about that bill? Okay, and if anything comes up, feel free to add it in the chat and we can respond.
Can I just
Amber,
add a point of clarification?
Yeah, absolutely, Angie.
Thank you. So I mean, I've been working with the Immigrant Justice Alliance for several years now, close to the inception of this bill. I do want to make sure that a lot of the situations that I think your examples that you provided with regards to Anchor, and there was one other example, those are really valid, and those are really important. But it's also in my mind, a little frustrating because some of the other situations that we talk about, like the hospitals, and the truly sort of the life and death situations with like law enforcement. And I've talked a lot about this in terms of like domestic violence survivors. Those would not be taken care of under this bill. Because this is for state agencies. It does not bring hospitals or any kind of medical professionals into it. And it also does not bring law enforcement into it. So to me, that's a really big gap that will remain, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think hopefully if we get this bill passed, it will open up the door for more advocacy, right, on these other specific issues. This also reminds me, I'm glad you mentioned about law enforcement. A couple of us in the API community did a training, a virtual training that's recorded for all law enforcement members in New Jersey. And unfortunately, law enforcement are still trained to use Google Translate as an option. The state has not developed a comprehensive language access policy and plan for their state law enforcement. And it is obviously a huge area of concern. I think hopefully with the passage, if we get the language access bill passed, it will generally provide more resources in terms of the state having to find, interpretation vendors, having to amplify, build on that contract. So hopefully the state will be at least more comfortable in wanting to do more because they'll have the sort of requirements of having to translate in other areas.
Can I ask a follow-up question to Anjali's comment about the hospitals? So I think, is it just that the law doesn't mandate hospitals to provide interpreter services? Because I think like some of the hospitals in New Jersey, I believe like Barnabas, I think they provide services for limited English speaking patients, but is that what the issue is with the bill right now when it comes to hospitals and other healthcare providers?
So I think what it is, and we'll talk about this a little bit in the difference between this bill and the data disaggregation bill, is this one is just for state agencies. And since hospitals are not considered state agencies, this bill would not apply to them. But yes, of course, an organization like Barnabas especially, which is basically a private entity, can, obviously go way beyond anything that New Jersey mandates. Usually any kind of laws that we talk about, whether it's at the federal level or even at the state level, is what we like to call it's the floor, not the ceiling. Like that's the base of what you have to provide. Anything you provide beyond that is up to you.
So basically we want to, I think, I guess the point is like, we want to make sure that it's not just these private hospitals that are providing these services. It's the large public hospitals, which probably end up serving more of these limited English speaking populations, right? I'm just making that up, but like that's a possibility. So yeah, okay, thank you.
Other than contacting our elected officials, it's very important that we get the experiences of our community members out there. So we've been working on trying to collect more stories for our story bank. If you've ever experienced a language access issue or your family, please feel free to email us at advocacy@aapimontclair.org. We would love to make sure that we can raise attention on particular experiences. Amber, should we go into the take action part or should we wait till the end?
Maybe we'll wait till the end after data disaggregation.
Great. All right, so I will pass it over to Anjali to talk about another important bill, the data disaggregation bill.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, all of you, Amber, especially for inviting me to speak today. This is obviously, to me, these bills have basically, they started out sort of together and they've more or less moved hand in hand. but we'll talk about some of the differences. The data disaggregation is another bill that I know has been a priority for the Immigration Justice Alliance, and I'm sure AAPI Montclair, now AAPI New Jersey. I'm just going to share my screen so I can go over a little bit about why this is important. Oops, sorry. What are you seeing on the screen sharing? Are you seeing?
Yep, we see your screen.
Okay,
We see the data slide.
okay. Okay, so data disaggregation in New Jersey. Firstly, what is data disaggregation? And data disaggregation in its very basic form is just the practice of, taking large amounts of data and breaking it up to smaller categories. And what we're talking about here is really disaggregating that data into like smaller specific groups for better analysis. And being able to reveal unique differences between groups. And why do we need it? And this is especially important to the AAPI community, because we know that the whole idea of, AAPI even, right? Or as the White House is now calling it, NHPI, is basically a sort of a weird construct created by the Census Bureau and OMB, where they have lumped, about 50 different geographical countries and communities together in a way that often doesn't make sense. So when you take data and you're aggregating it across that entire spectrum, there are a lot of differences that get masked. And it really hurts us in terms of resource, what's the word I'm looking for? Allocation. So communities that need resources sometimes don't get them. And it also doesn't really provide a true picture of what our different groups look like and what their needs are. So just to give you a basic idea, this is what the OMB standards for the most part are. In the 2020 census, they did actually separate out Asian and Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander. But the other categories based on race are white. And it's interesting because it's not just peoples of Europe, but it's also Middle East and North Africa. So when you think of Arabs, they're actually considered white in America, which is a whole other thing that we could do a whole lunch and learn about, what white is in America. Black or African American is obviously, we are more familiar with that, but it's important to note that more and more we have a very, very sort of thriving African American diaspora in America now, which is, so they're not just sort of the descendants of, the African Americans who were brought over as slaves, but people who are emigrating to the United States and immigrating to the United States rather, from Africa in recent times. The American Indian or Alaskan Native, of course, is the indigenous people of these lands. Asians, as I mentioned, is very, very wide. It goes all the way from Japan to, South Asia. And as you can imagine, there's some of those communities really don't have a lot in common. And the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders are really the Hawaiian Islands and other US territories in the Pacific. If anybody has any questions at any point, stop me, or we'll ask questions in the end. And of course, why it's important is because, accurate data is the first step to taking action. So whether we're talking about health outcomes, whether we're talking about, disparities in education and housing, in poverty levels, all of that, if we're going to look for solutions for those outcomes, we can't do that unless we have actual data and we have accurate data on what these communities are facing. And here are some examples of how this really plays out currently. So this is one that is particularly passionate, that I'm passionate about. I also represent an organization called the American Association for University Women. We are very focused on employment and education opportunities for women. So the gender pay gap is one of our biggest issues. Actually, AUW is the leading advocacy group on gender pay gap and pay equity. So when you look at the earnings data, comparing all the different race groups, and you see where all women are compared to men, women are generally at about 84 cents for every dollar that a white non-Hispanic man makes. Black women are at 69, Latinas are at 57, and then you look at Asian American women and they look like they're doing really well because they're at 99%. So what happens, what this means is that when you're looking for resources and when you're talking about the gender pay gap, people are like, oh, we don't need to worry about Asian Americans, they're great, they're doing fine. But then when you break down that data into disaggregated data, you see the real differences that exist, the disparities that exist. So yes, for example, Taiwanese, Indian, even, Chinese Americans, they are pretty much high up on that scale. But when you start to get to the bottom of it, and you look at Nepalese women, you look at Bangladeshis, Burmese, even Hawaiian women, there is a large disparity within this group. So to then not provide resources or not understand that some of these groups are being severely underpaid for the work that they're performing is really a disservice to those groups. So it's really, really important to look at disaggregated data. We see the same thing in terms of poverty levels. So again, Asian Americans often called the model minority, thought of as being very successful, very economically affluent, especially in states like New Jersey. But when you look at it again, based on disaggregated data, there are some that are doing well. And I would say Indian Americans probably fall in that too. But then there are other groups like Burmese, Nepalese, Bangladeshis that had much higher poverty levels that are being masked, and those communities need all of the services and programs that are available out there. I think this one is an interesting graph because again, it shows some of those diasporas that I talked about before in terms of Black and African diaspora. But I think it's also really interesting in terms of what we call the MENA communities, which is the Middle Eastern and North African communities. So even though those communities are considered white, you can see there is a large disparity in the poverty levels between our white communities and some of those other MENA communities. So very briefly, what this bill does, and we can drop this in the chat. I would definitely recommend everybody read this bill. It requires state agencies update their demographic data collection methods. I'm going to just highlight some pieces of the bill here. I think it's really important. I think Jeff touched on this before, that we are one of the most diverse states, and especially in terms of AAPI. We're about 10% of the state's population. And if we're not collecting the data on all of these separate groups, we cannot accurately determine what their current needs are. And this is true of both the AAPI communities and the MENA communities. These are the two communities that are really the target of this bill. And so the bill would require that each state agency that collects data directly or contracts. And this is the important piece. This is the difference from what we were talking about before, because almost all the hospitals in New Jersey are contracted to collect data for the state government. So agencies like hospitals, public school systems, all of those would be required to follow these guidelines. And that's an important distinction, because one of the biggest areas of disparities we know are health outcomes. And we know that health data that is specific to ethnic communities is really important. The data would be collected for each major Asian group. And I know there's been some confusion about this, so I want to clarify that both Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshis, all of these South Asian groups do fall under the Asian groups. Then there's also major Pacific Islander group, major Middle Eastern and North African group, as we talked about, but also the Indian diaspora. And there is a significant population of people of Indian origin that frankly have not lived in the Indian subcontinent for generations, but still sort of identify as Indian. And it's important to collect them as a separate group because often on these census tables and forms, they don't really know which box they should check or how they fit in. And the two things that they're going to be collecting also along with race is the primary language spoken at home and also ethnic group and ancestry. So I think those will help also in continued advocacy efforts. So as you can see, this is really important. I will say one of the differences is that this bill also similar to the language access bill has passed one chamber of our state legislature. It actually passed the assembly last year, and we're waiting for it to pass in the Senate. It has had one Senate hearing, and we are hearing that most probably it is not going to get a second committee hearing, that it is going to be scheduled for a straight floor vote. We are hoping at this point on 12/21. So at this point, I can stop the screen share and turn it over for questions.
Thank you, Anjali. I have a question. So if we disaggregate the data, does that prevent us from also rolling everything back up when we need to for other purposes, for example, in redistricting discussions? So once we break it down, we can also still, when
Right.
needed, use that Asian American category.
I have a question. I know with language access, there's a bill in New York that mandates all of that. Is there anything in New York or other nearby municipalities that have a similar data disaggregation bill?
That's a good question. I'm not sure that I know the answer offhand on that. I mean, I can tell you what it's interesting to me because data disaggregation is also something that they're looking at the federal level. And at the federal level, they're looking at it on a much broader term. So for example, there are certain communities, especially the Pacific Islander communities, that are, there are 4 different ways, I believe, that the federal government collects sort of demographic data. 4 different forms, I mean, so along with the census, there are 3 other population data collecting points, and those communities are completely omitted from those surveys. So at the federal level, this is much bigger because those communities are not even collected. They're just completely omitted. So I think hopefully, all of that will roll down in some ways, right? But I don't know if other states, but it would be a good idea to look at probably like California or New York to see if they're doing the same.
That's an interesting question. New York did pass, Governor Hochul did sign a data disaggregation bill in 2021. So unfortunately, on both issues of language access and data disaggregation, our neighbors across the Hudson are a few years at least ahead of us.
I had a question about the language access bill. How did we arrive at the list of 15 languages. I noticed Gujarati and Hindi are on the list, and I'm wondering why there's no inclusion of any of the Southern Indian languages. I do think we have significant Tamilian and Telugu speaking populations in our state.
That's a good, yeah, that's an important point. So in all transparency, I think the number of languages is a touch point that the legislature and the governor's office haven't agreed exactly on how many languages. So that's concerning. But the second thing is the final kind of list of languages, there's actually not going to be like a final list. It's always going to be something that's evolving, right? Because the number of languages, say they ended up choosing 12, those languages are always going to be tied to the census data and also other data. So if the government agencies are noticing that there's a lot more speakers for X language, that language might be, part of the number of languages that get translated. Does that make sense?
I think the bill actually calls for the top 15 languages that have a limited English proficiency. So it's going to be based on census data, whatever the latest census data shows. And it's really depends on, it's not so much how many households speak the language, but it's really how many households lack English proficiency. And
is that, I'm sorry.
a lot of the South Asian languages, frankly, most people are bilingual. So that's why they don't fall into those categories.
But how do you know how is commonly spoken defined in the bill? Like a certain percentage, or like has that been sort of hashed out yet in the bill?
I believe it's not just commonly spoken. I think it's limited English proficiency. So when households are declaring themselves as having members of the household that don't have English proficiency enough to communicate with state agencies that provide services and programs, I think that's what the highlighting feature is. So for example, you could have, for example, my household, my husband and I both speak Hindi at home, but we're both bilingual. Our kids speak, mix of both languages. We would not be counted in that number.
I also, Susan, just more directly, I think once the bill gets passed and signed, there's going to be an implementation phase, right, where a lot of these issues, the advocacy in many ways just doesn't end, right? Because when something gets implemented, there's going to be more advocacy to see how we want it to actually be implemented. And then two, there's going to be, right, the whole issue with administrative regulations, right? The regs that are going to go along with this law, right? Which needs to be ironed out after the law gets passed. So I think that'll be another opportunity for advocates to be involved on what this actually will look and feel, right? Hopefully when this law gets passed.
Okay.
Thank you. So we're very fortunate to have been joined by one of the bill's prime sponsors and a champion of other policies that would advance the welfare of the AAPI and other communities in New Jersey. I feel like I'm introducing a game show contestant. She's our first Korean American female legislator and just a champion and a role model all around. It is in transit, Assemblywoman Ellen Park. Ellen, thank you so much for joining, and we'd love to hear, about why you've been championing these two policies. Let me spotlight you, and yeah, what you're seeing in the legislature.
So first, I want to wish everybody happy holidays and a happy New Year. And as far as me being the champion, I guess, I am the only Asian representative in the state legislature. And with
Oh, Ellen, you're muted now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. It's really important um, in that, as you guys have mentioned, New Jersey is probably, one of the diverse states in America. And, now there's about 11% Asians in New Jersey. And so there's definitely a need for language access. And yeah, and even though we're, kind of grouped in together as Asians, we come from different places. We speak different languages. And I think it's about time that we, have some recognition, whether we're Korean or Chinese or Japanese, that we are not all the same, right? And so I think also that data is very important as well. And yeah, I really hope that it passes the floor come next week.
So data disaggregation on the floor of the Senate next week.
Yeah.
And how about language access?
I believe was well, hopefully. I know they're still working on it. I think, Ed, we had discussed before about it being 15 languages is, I know that they're kind of a little bit of a pushback saying it's just might be too much of a burden on the state to, have 15 languages. We're still gonna work on it and I'm gonna push for it, but I think that is probably a harder bill than the disaggregation. So we'll see. Keep our fingers crossed.
Do you have thoughts on what we as community members can do to help?
I think right now, we'll see if it's actually on the floor come next week. If it's not, obviously we're gonna have to push for it next year. But it's also the end of the year. And I feel like especially with so much change in the legislature, there's so many new people, there are people leaving. I think, we're going to try, but again, I think for now, because it's end of the year and this is my first lame duck as well, if it doesn't get on the floor this year, we're going to push for it for next year. And then for sure, if it goes next year, I'm going to then give you guys a call to help me, whether it's petitioning and going to, or, helping me speak to each of the individual members. We'll do something to really push it next year together.
All right. Thank you so much. We should let you get to where you're going.
Yeah,
really appreciate it.
Right. For a meeting into the city, but again, I want to just wish everybody happy holidays, happy new year, and let's just hope for the best next week. And if not, then I'll definitely reach out to you guys for the following year to really push this bill, and maybe we can come up with some other ideas as well. So take care, everyone, and I want to thank you for all your support. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ellen.
Yeah. Bye.
So perfect segue to our action steps, Jeff. Shall we talk about?
Yeah, do you want to pop that on the screen? So we're also going to just include this in the chat and follow up in emails about this. But if you have time, today, please call Assembly Speaker Coughlin's office at that 732 number. He is the speaker, so he does have quite a few staff. So I've always been able to talk to a live person. Assemblyman Varelli also as well. Try to do it if you can right after this meeting would be great, or this afternoon. Today is a very critical day. There's only a couple more days left before the holidays. So please give them a call and let them know why Language Access Bill A3837, easy to remember, 3837 is so important. And let us know, email us and let us know how it went. And Anjali, do you want to talk about how people can take action on data disaggregation? I know that you have a really great letter that people can just sign on to.
Sure. So I put it in the chat. This is an easy action. It's a click action. Basically, if you click on the link, it brings you to a letter that's already pre-written. You have the ability to edit it. And we always recommend if you have your own story, your own thing to add to it, you should. And with the click of a button, it will send a letter to your senator. So because this is regarding the data disaggregation bill that has already passed in the Assembly, but we really want to see bipartisan support for it in the Senate when it comes up for a vote. So we're asking everybody to vote to contact their senators to vote yes on the bill. So this is a really easy way of doing it.
Thank you. And we can email these links to you after we get off this call as well. Are there any final questions for our amazing speakers today? Okay. Well, go ahead, Jeff.
I was going to say, if you have a minute, just copy and paste the action things that we dropped in the chat, both Anjali's link to the letter, and also what I just dropped about the brief script, and also the phone numbers.
Thank you so much for joining our first Lunch and Learn, spending this hour with us. Well, let's give you your 8 minutes back. But again, we'll be sending these links out to you, and we really appreciate your showing up and caring today.
Please use those 8 minutes to make those calls. Thank you, everyone. Have a good weekend.
Thank you. Bye.